What if death itself refused to stay silent? In the winter of 1877, in the bleak hills of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, a young bride named Zona Heaster Shue was laid into the frozen earth. Her husband stood over her grave, insisting her passing was sudden and natural. But within nights, whispers rose in the farmhouse shadows. Zona's ghost appeared to her grieving mother, speaking of violence, of strangulation, of betrayal in the night. Here lies the only American murder case where a ghost's testimony brought a killer to justice. If tales of forgotten graves, haunted legacies, and voices from beyond stir your spirit, do not wander these shadows alone. Step deeper into history's cold embrace, and subscribe now, so you may never miss the whispers that the living tried to bury. The winter of 1877 had settled over Greenbrier County like a shroud. The Appalachian ridges loomed dark against the ashen sky, their skeletal trees clawing at the heavens as though begging for mercy. In this frozen landscape, where hunger bit like wolves and the wind carried the echo of prayers unheeded, a young woman named Zona Heaster Shue walked into the shadow of fate. She had been a bride for but a few fleeting months. Those who saw her spoke of her beauty, the warmth of her laughter, and the innocence still lingering in her eyes. Yet beneath that fragile radiance there was a quiet unease. Zona had placed her trust in Edward Shue, a blacksmith whose past was whispered about in half-spoken rumors. He had appeared in Greenbrier like a storm cloud rolling down from the mountains, tall, handsome, and eager to claim a wife. But storms never arrive without destruction, and some neighbors sensed a violence hidden beneath his charm. Their home, a small farmhouse settled deep in a hollow, seemed always cloaked in a kind of unnatural stillness. The fire inside burned low, shadows quivering against the walls as if recoiling from the man who dwelled there. Zona's steps grew quieter each day, her frame wearier, her voice softer, as though she were learning to vanish within her own house. The mountains groaned with ice and the fields lay barren under frost, but inside that house another hunger gnawed, the hunger of fear tightening like a noose around her heart. In December, when the cold was at its cruelest, the inevitable came. One bitter morning, neighbors entered to find Zona lifeless at the foot of the staircase. Her body was sprawled unnaturally, her head bent aside at an angle that spoke more of violence than of accident. Her dress was arranged neatly, as if placed there by deliberate hands, not the chaos of a fall. Edward declared it a tragedy, a sudden collapse, a fainting spell, a cruel trick of the body. But his words carried no sorrow, only impatience, as though her death were an inconvenience rather than a wound. The house itself seemed to absorb the silence that followed. The boards creaked under the weight of grief, the fire sputtered and died, and the bitter wind clawed through cracks in the walls. Zona's stillness lingered in every corner. Her mother, Mary Jane Heaster, was called to the house, and as she looked upon her daughter's body, a cold certainty pressed against her chest. Something was not right. Zona's once bright eyes were dimmed forever, but her twisted neck spoke a truth the living refused to voice. Neighbors whispered about Edward's odd behavior. He dressed Zona's corpse himself, insisting on a high-collared gown that clutched at her throat like a shroud. He refused to let anyone near, pacing like a sentinel guarding a secret. His movements were sharp, his words curt, his eyes restless, not of a man grieving, but of a man cornered. And so, as the coffin was closed, the valley seemed to fall silent, holding its breath. Snow began to fall, soft and endless, burying the world in white. But beneath that hush, Mary Jane's gaze lingered on her daughter's neck, on the collar pulled too tightly, and in her bones she felt it, the grave had been filled too soon. As the earth closed over Zona's coffin, Mary Jane whispered a prayer through frozen lips, but the wind carried back something darker, as though the hollow itself had a secret yet to speak. The farmhouse stood heavy with sorrow, yet it was not the sorrow of mourning alone. It was a sorrow that clung like rot in the beams, a silence that dripped from the rafters as though the house itself were bleeding shadows. After Zona's sudden death, neighbors gathered out of duty, their boots leaving dark trails of melted snow across the floorboards, their eyes darting from the still form to the restless figure of Edward Shue. He insisted she had died from everlasting faint, words strange and hollow, as though spoken from a book of excuses rather than from grief. Whispers crept through the air. That Zona had not been ill, that no signs of weakness had been seen in her days before. Yet Edward carried himself with a fierce resolve, pacing the room like a caged animal, forbidding curious hands from tending to his wife's body. When the time came to prepare Zona for burial, it was Edward who took the task upon himself. In the flickering glow of lamplight, he forced her into a high-collared gown, stiff with lace and binding tight against her throat. He arranged a veil across her face, smoothed her hair with meticulous care, and tied ribbons as though weaving secrecy into the fabric. To the neighbors who watched, his hands trembled not with grief but with urgency, as though he were hiding something too terrible to expose. Zona's body lay in the parlor, her neck obscured, her stillness guarded by her husband who never strayed far from her side. Whenever eyes lingered too long, Edward would shift his stance, blocking their view. When questions were raised, his voice flared sharp, silencing them with tones that bit like cold iron. The house grew stifling under his watch, the air thick with unspoken dread. And yet beneath this veil of secrecy, Mary Jane Heaster's gaze pierced through. She saw the stiffness of her daughter's posture, the way the head resisted rest upon the pillow, the unnatural bend beneath the collar. Grief should have blurred her vision, but instead it sharpened it. Each passing hour in that house deepened her unease. The minister spoke of God's will, his words floating like dust in the stillness. But the silence of the house resisted prayer, and even the holy syllables seemed swallowed by the gloom. The fire in the hearth sputtered, its warmth too feeble to drive away the cold that pressed in through the cracks. Zona's parlor became not a place of mourning, but a chamber of secrets, where sorrow was not wept but stifled. Neighbors murmured afterward that Edward's behavior was unlike any widower they had ever seen. His grief was theatrical, too sharp at the edges, his pacing constant, his eyes restless as though expecting to be accused. He spoke of her as though she were a burden lifted rather than a love lost. And still always, his hands lingered near her neck, tugging the collar, smoothing the cloth, ensuring that none would look too closely at what lay beneath. Mary Jane stayed long into the night beside her daughter's body, the shadows from the lamps stretching across the walls like grasping fingers. Hunger gnawed at her belly, yet she would not leave, for the silence of the room was louder than any storm. She felt something stir at the edges of her grief, a whisper without sound, a pressure in her bones that told her this was not the end. That night after the coffin was lowered into frozen ground, Mary Jane returned to her cabin and fell into uneasy sleep. And in the depths of her slumber, her daughter came to her, eyes hollow, hands trembling, her bent neck speaking a truth the earth could not contain. Sleep did not come gently to Mary Jane Heaster. It arrived like a storm rolling over the mountains, heavy, oppressive, filled with unseen weight. In her narrow cabin, where the hearth had cooled to ash and the wind pressed its frozen fingers through the cracks in the walls, she laid her weary body upon the bed. Grief gnawed at her bones, but it was not grief alone that hollowed her chest. It was suspicion, festering, sharp as a splinter that could not be pulled free. And then came the dreams. Zona appeared before her mother's eyes as if woven from smoke and sorrow. She stood in the doorway, pale as frost, her bridal gown a shroud of white fire that flickered without flame. Her hands trembled, reaching through the darkness, but it was her neck that drew the eye, bent at an impossible angle, her head lolling as though the tendons were threads too weak to hold. "Mother," the voice came, but it was not carried by lips. It was etched into the marrow of Mary Jane's bones. "He has murdered me." Mary Jane bolted upright, the sweat of terror slick on her brow, her breath visible in the freezing air. But when she blinked, her daughter was gone, and only the silence remained, that dreadful silence that seemed heavier than any scream. Night after night, Zona returned. Each visitation carried more detail, each word slicing deeper into the veil between life and death. She spoke of Edward's rage, of his cruel hand, of the moment when his grip clamped around her throat. She described the pressure, the snap, the final gasp stolen from her lungs. Her voice was broken glass, her movements strained, her spectral body twisting as though reliving the violence again and again. Mary Jane begged for the dreams to cease, but they would not. Zona appeared in the cabin's shadows, on the road outside, reflected in the dark panes of the window. Her mother could not eat, could not sleep, could not think of anything but her daughter's bent form and her whispered plea. The townsfolk muttered that grief had unhinged her. But Mary Jane knew with a conviction that was unshakable, this was no fevered madness. Her daughter was not at rest. Her spirit clawed at the grave, reaching back through the veil, demanding that the truth be heard. One night the visitation changed. Zona's ghost lingered longer, her face clear in the flicker of spectral light. She recounted, step by step, how Edward had strangled her in a fit of fury. She named the time, the place, the act. And when she finished, she placed her cold, translucent hand upon her mother's arm. Mary Jane felt it, sharp as ice, burning into her flesh with a reality no dream could conjure. When morning came, Mary Jane rose not as a grieving mother, but as a witness burdened with testimony from the grave. She carried in her chest the impossible, a story spoken not by the living but by the dead. As snow buried the roads of Greenbrier in white silence, Mary Jane resolved to walk them, to bring the ghost's testimony before the law. But the question haunted her with every step. Would the living dare to listen to the voice of the dead? The roads of Greenbrier were narrow veins through the wilderness, twisting beneath skeletal trees and snow-laden hills. On one bitter morning, Mary Jane Heaster wrapped herself in a thin shawl, her boots crunching against the frost, and set forth toward the magistrate's office. Her body ached with age, but her spirit burned with a flame stoked not by grief alone, but by justice whispered through dreams. The sky was iron-gray, the wind keening like a dirge. Yet she walked as though driven by something greater than herself, each step echoing the spectral words of her daughter. Zona's voice lingered in her ears, her cold touch still imprinted upon her arm. The grave had spoken, and Mary Jane would not allow its testimony to vanish into the silence of winter. When she reached the office of the magistrate, her figure seemed a shadow against the frost-bitten world. Inside, men warmed themselves around a weak fire, their faces ruddy with cold and suspicion. Mary Jane told her story with a trembling voice that grew stronger with each word. Of the dreams, of the visions, of the bent neck and broken breath. She recited the ghost's testimony as though it were scripture. The magistrate listened, his expression unreadable, the crackle of the fire the only sound between her sentences. To most, her words might have sounded like madness, the fevered delusions of a grieving mother. Yet something in her tone, something in the certainty carved into her voice, unsettled even the most skeptical. And so the whisper began to spread. Neighbors recalled Edward Trout Shue's strange behavior, his obsessive guarding of Zona's body, his insistence on the high-collared dress. Others spoke of his violent temper, the unease he carried like a storm cloud. Slowly, suspicion crept into the hollow, winding through the community like frost creeping into the cracks of stone. It was enough to prompt action. The county authorities, reluctant but pressed by growing unease, ordered Zona's body exhumed. The grave was reopened, shovels biting into frozen earth as the wind howled overhead. The coffin emerged from the ground like a secret torn from silence, the wood groaning as it was pried open. And there lay Zona, her face pale with death, but her body carrying truths the living had ignored. The doctor's hands moved with solemn care. Beneath the collar, beneath the lace and ribbon, the truth revealed itself. Her windpipe was crushed, her neck broken in a manner no fall could explain. Bones whispered the testimony her spirit had already spoken, and science itself bent to the words of the grave. The hush that fell upon the gathered crowd was heavier than any storm. Zona had not died by accident. She had been slain. Edward Trout Shue was seized, his defiance flaring in his eyes even as iron shackles closed around his wrists. He spat denials, but the valley had already shifted. The silence of the hollow was broken, and the dead had named her killer. Yet as Edward was led away, his gaze burned not with fear but with something darker, a hidden terror that flickered like shadowed fire. It was as though he feared not judgment in this world, but some greater reckoning still waiting in the next. And in that moment, the townsfolk wondered if the ghost of Zona Heaster Shue had only begun to speak. The courthouse at Greenbrier filled like a theater, every bench and corner brimming with bodies pressed close together, their breath rising in clouds against the bitter cold. The people had come not merely to see justice served, but to glimpse the macabre spectacle. A husband accused, a bride's ghost invoked, and the law itself asked to reckon with voices from the grave. Edward Trout Shue sat stiff and proud, his shoulders squared, his jaw clenched as though defiance alone could shield him. His eyes roved the courtroom, but they never softened, never dimmed with sorrow. He wore no expression of guilt, only irritation, as though the world itself had wronged him by daring to doubt his word. The prosecutor spoke of the body exhumed, the bones revealed, the crushed windpipe, the broken neck. He laid out the evidence with cold precision, each word echoing like the toll of a bell. Witnesses came forward, neighbors who whispered of Edward's strange behavior, his obsessive guarding of Zona's corpse, his insistence on concealing her throat beneath lace and ribbon. Then came the murmurs of darker revelations. That this was not Edward's first wife, that another woman had died under suspicious circumstances, her story buried in silence and fear. A shadow stretched backward through time, hinting at a pattern, a hunger, a violence that had stalked more than one home. But it was Mary Jane Heaster who drew every eye when she took the stand. Her figure was frail, her hands trembling, yet her voice carried like a storm through the chamber. She told of her dreams, of Zona's visitations, of the words spoken by the ghost in the long nights of winter. She recounted the touch of her daughter's spectral hand, the recounting of murder itself. The judge allowed her testimony, though law had no place for the voices of the dead. Some in the crowd scoffed, whispering of madness, while others listened in hushed awe, their eyes darting to the corners of the room as if expecting Zona herself to appear. Edward's lawyer laughed bitterly, dismissing the tale as the wild fancies of grief. Yet even as he ridiculed, unease coiled in the air. The ghost's presence lingered, unspoken but palpable, as though every creak of the courthouse timbers, every groan of the winter wind, carried her invisible voice. Day bled into night, testimony layered upon testimony, until the weight of evidence crushed even the laughter of the defense. The bones spoke louder than the living. The silence of Zona's bent neck filled the gaps no witness could bridge. At last the jury withdrew, leaving the chamber heavy with breathless anticipation. Edward sat motionless, his face pale, his lips pursed in a thin line. His eyes fixed not upon the floor, not upon his accusers, but somewhere beyond, as if he saw a figure only he could behold. His chest rose and fell, not with fear, but with something darker, the dread of a reckoning that the gallows themselves could not match. The jurors filed back into the room, their faces pale, their steps deliberate. The crowd leaned forward, hearts thundering, the air taut as a string pulled to the point of breaking. And in that moment before the verdict was spoken, the silence of the room was absolute, a silence so deep it felt as though the grave itself was listening. The verdict came down like thunder rolling through the hollows, guilty of murder in the first degree. The courthouse erupted in a flurry of whispers and gasps, a storm of voices swelling against the wooden walls. Edward Trout Shue sat rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp as flint. He showed no collapse, no plea for mercy, only that same restless defiance, as if even the chains around his wrists could not bind the storm inside him. The law, in its measured hand, did not sentence him to hang, but to spend the rest of his life in the iron belly of the state penitentiary. Yet to the crowd packed inside and spilling onto the courthouse steps, prison seemed a mercy too soft, a shelter unworthy of the blood Zona had spilled. Hunger for vengeance burned hotter than the torches that flickered outside. As the news spread, the hills of Greenbrier stirred like a hive struck by stone. Men muttered in taverns, women whispered at wells, children listened with wide eyes to stories of the ghost who had spoken. And with every telling, the fury grew. By nightfall, a mob had gathered, torches blazing, ropes coiled in calloused fists. They surged toward the jail where Edward was held, their cries echoing like wolves in the frozen night. "Hang him! Hang him where he stands!" They howled, their voices rising like a storm wind tearing through the valley. Boots pounded the dirt road, flames licked at the black sky, and the cold night seemed to tremble with rage. Inside, deputies stood with rifles at the ready, their faces pale, their hands unsteady. The sheriff himself faced the mob, his voice cutting through the frenzy. He begged for calm, for law, for order. His words clashed against the roar of vengeance, but still he pressed on, his frame unmoving before the tide. For hours the crowd pressed against the jail, their shouts crashing like waves upon stone. The torches sputtered, the air reeked of smoke and sweat, the tension stretched to breaking. But slowly, unwillingly, the storm began to fade. The sheriff's line held, and the mob retreated into the night, their fury dimmed but not extinguished. Edward remained alive, locked away, yet the whispers that followed him grew sharper. Some said Zona's ghost had appeared that night among the crowd, her pale form drifting between torches, her bent neck a reminder of the justice still unfulfilled. Others swore they heard her cry in the wind, urging the living not to let him escape his fate. When Edward was finally sent to the penitentiary, his defiance had not waned. Yet within the cold stone walls, rumors spread of his restlessness, his muttering to shadows, his sleepless nights haunted by visions no man could name aloud. Prisoners whispered that he woke screaming, clutching at his throat, his voice strangled by unseen hands. Greenbrier was quiet once more, but not at peace. The hollow carried the memory of torches and fury, of a ghost's vengeance written into the fabric of law. Zona's justice had been declared, but the air still quivered with unease, as though her story had not yet closed. And in the silence that followed, a question lingered, heavy as frost on the branches. Had the gallows been cheated, or had something darker than the noose already claimed him? Years stretched like shadows across the valley, and the echo of the trial dimmed, yet it never truly vanished. Edward Shue lived out his days behind prison walls, his body caged but his spirit unquiet. Inmates spoke of his muttering, of the way he flinched at corners of the cell, his eyes fixed on emptiness as though something unseen stalked him in the dark. They said he cried out in the dead of night, gasping for air, clawing at his throat with desperate hands until his nails broke and bled. Death came to him not with the swiftness of rope, but with the slow decay of time. When at last he was buried, no marker bore his name, and the soil that swallowed him seemed eager to forget. Yet Greenbrier could not forget. The farmhouse where Zona had lived fell into ruin, its windows shattering under storms, its timbers warping with rot. The hearth turned cold, vines crawled through broken floorboards, and the hollow consumed what remained. But the land remembered. Travelers swore that on winter nights, when the moon rode pale and thin, a figure drifted near the house, a woman in white, her head bent unnaturally to one side, her eyes hollow wells of sorrow. Children whispered of her when they passed on the road, daring each other to glance toward the hollow after sunset. Some claimed they saw a flicker in the fields, a veil brushing against the snow, a hand raised as if to beckon. The brave swore they heard her voice, faint as the hiss of wind through dead leaves, calling from beyond the veil. Zona's ghost was said to have faded after Edward's trial, but stories have a way of rekindling when silence grows too heavy. Fragments of the tale found their way into journals and court records, but it was the oral tradition, the fire-lit retellings, that carved it deepest into memory. Mothers told their children of the bride who would not